Right, well, I'm going to kick off as people are coming into the room, because I'm not the important person, so it doesn't matter what I say. But good afternoon, everyone here in London and online. I think we've got a very large online presence this afternoon. I'm Sam Attridge. I'm the director of our Centre for Research on Private Finance and Sustainable Development. And we're absolutely thrilled to welcome everybody here today for the launch of the second edition of the Publish What You Fund DFI Transparency Index. At ODI, we're big fans and supporters of Publish What You Fund's work, because transparency isn't just a technical detail, it's absolutely essential for our work, but for many others too. And without it, we can't assess impact, we can't ensure value for money, or even make smart policy decisions. And I think when MDBs, multilateral development banks, and development finance institutions, DFIs, are backed by public funds, whether that be through government equity investment or scarce aid, that public role, we think, brings a responsibility. We need to know how that money is being used and whether it delivers real impact. And in today's world, with climate pressures, shrinking aid budgets, and a growing financing gap, every dollar must work harder. And transparency will help us make that happen. It builds trust, and it gives policymakers and investors the data they need to avoid duplication, improve coordination, and target resources where they're needed the most. And so this index brings much needed visibility to the sector. It sets benchmarks, creates a healthy pressure, which I welcome, and drives change. And we've already seen some institutions improve since the first edition, and we'll hear a lot more about this from Gary, and I'm not going to steal his thunder because they've worked so hard. But it also debunks the myths, especially on the private capital side of things, that commercial confidentiality blocks transparencies, because we see some DFIs can share data on impact, mobilization, and subsidies. So if they can, why can't others? And this is the value, I think, of the index, of bringing everybody up. And I think also what makes your work, Gary, and others stand out is your collaborative, constructive approach in bringing these institutions along. So this isn't just a scorecard, it's a tool for accountability and a foundation, I believe, for systemic change. And finally, because I'm a Brit, I love talking about the weather. And yes, it is cloudy today, but we've had some sunny spells. And I think that's just like the index, cutting through the cloud and shining a light on what MDBs and DFIs are doing and where progress is still needed. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. Just a bit of housekeeping to do. If you hear a fire alarm go off, it's real. Don't panic though, because the exit is literally just there. You haven't got far to go. And then we walk out the building and we congregate under the bridge. And the toilets are out there in reception. So I'm really happy to introduce Gary Forster, who's the CEO of Publish What You Fund, who's going to present the findings. And then our wonderful Hans-Peter Lankers, our Deputy CEO, is going to moderate an esteemed panel. We're very happy to have such a great panel here today. Then we're going to have some time for some good questions and answers, so feel free. Online as well, you can post in the Q&A box, and that will be channeled to Hans-Peter, and then Hans-Peter will make some closing remarks. So without further ado, Gary, please reveal all.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the 2025 DFI Transparency Index. So we launched the inaugural DFI Transparency Index in 2023 because we saw a critical gap. We saw that DFIs were growing in scale, in importance, and in influence, but their transparency of their operations wasn't keeping pace. To put things into perspective, the DFIs in the DFI Transparency Index have total assets worth more than $3 trillion. So now, 2 years later, we return with a new assessment, an improved methodology, and deeper insights into the disclosure of these institutions. Today, I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, the results of the 2025 DFI Transparency Index. Secondly, a quick overview of our website and the valuable information and recommendations we have for stakeholders, shareholders, and DFIs. And lastly, we're going to have a frank conversation about the state of transparency of non-sovereign or private sector development finance institutions and what that means for private capital mobilization, the cost of capital in Africa, and the goals laid out in FFD4. So in terms of the headlines, firstly, it's important to note that we have seen improvements almost across the board. DFI transparency has increased. We've got more data, we've got more accessible formats, we've got more consistency, and we should acknowledge this progress and the work that sits behind it. However, overall, transparency remains low, especially for non-sovereign DFIs, and particularly in the most critical areas of impact data, private capital mobilization, climate finance, and assurance of community accountability. And I'll come back to those specific issues in a moment. So starting with the sovereign rankings, the World Bank topped the sovereign transparency rankings, followed by the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank. The World Bank made a significant improvement since 2023, already a strong performer on development impact. The bank made yet more progress through its corporate scorecard, providing project level data on a range of indicators. So congratulations to these organizations. On to the non-sovereign results. On to the non-sovereign results. The Asian Development Bank ranked highest in the non-sovereign assessment, followed by the International Finance Corporation and the African Development Bank. British International Investment, BII, was the highest ranked bilateral non-sovereign DFI, reflecting significant progress following targeted transparency reforms. The US International Development Finance Corporation was the only DFI to see a drop in transparency due to reduced disclosure of climate and impact information. I'd like to take a moment to recognize progress where it's due. I've mentioned the World Bank and BII already, but it's notable in the report that both CAF and CIFM also made substantial gains. That came down to a combination of internal leadership, political pressure, and collaboration with our team. We hope this can become a model for others to make systematic improvements. We also in the report, sorry, I'm struggling to get the slides to move forward. There we go. We also in the report talk about, but don't rank, 7 large bilateral DFIs, including the China Development Bank. These organizations are excluded simply because they remain too opaque to assess. So going back to the headlines in detail and starting with impact. In 2023, the index found, and my remarks here are focusing mostly on the non-sovereign development finance institutions, because that's where the biggest improvement is needed. You'll see that clearly in the report. So in 2023, the index found that the transparency of non-sovereign results data was extremely low. Only one institution, IFU, disclosed data for actual results in a systematic manner. So have things changed? No. The 2025 DFI Transparency Index found that little progress has been made by non-sovereign DFIs in improving the disclosure of results data. As in 2023, the only non-sovereign institution to pass our results survey question was IFU. Moving on to private capital mobilization. 2 DFIs, CAF and IDB Invest, began disclosing private capital mobilization data at a project level for the first time, marking important progress and showing, as Sam mentioned, what is possible. Given the expectations around private capital mobilization, it's important to note the gap with the other institutions between their rhetoric and evidence that they're providing on their private capital mobilization. So this year, we also introduced some new indicators on climate finance transparency and found that many DFIs are now publishing methodology showing how they calculate their climate finance, but very few are disclosing project level climate data. As public attention and financing for climate action intensifies, this will need to change. And then on to environmental and social disclosures and what we call assurance of community accountability. So environmental and social disclosures remain inadequately disclosed by many DFIs. While sovereign multilateral DFIs actually perform reasonably well, the picture is much worse amongst non-sovereign institutions. These organizations disclose extremely limited information about the E and S risks of their investments, while none systematically disclosed E&S documentation such as environmental and social impact assessments and stakeholder engagement plans. in our report, we revisit the issue of what we call assurance of community disclosure. In short, we assess whether or not it is possible to tell whether DFIs or their clients fulfill their responsibilities in disclosing information to project affected people. We found that there has been little progress in this area since 2023. While DFIs have ENS policies that generally promote timely community disclosure, it is largely impossible to know if these policies are actually being followed. So seen together, this is frankly disappointing. DFIs exist first and foremost to make a positive impact on lives and markets in developing economies. They are at the forefront of the battle against climate change. And as a minimum, they must demonstrate they are doing more good than harm in the communities where they operate. And for non-sovereign DFIs, it's just impossible to know any of this. So let me quickly move on to the index website and the detailed DFI profiles that we have there, so you get an idea of how rich that information is and how useful that could be for you if you're holding DFI's account, or if you are actually working within a DFI and you want to understand what the opportunities to improve are. So the DFI transparency website, here's the website with the main index page. You can select whether you want to review non-sovereign or sovereign institutions. You'll then see the appropriate rankings. On the screen right now, I'm showing the non-sovereign rankings. If you scroll down, you'll see a detailed table which gives you each organization's score with for each of the components reviewed in the index. The next step is to click on a DFI and see a specific highly detailed DFI profile. On the screen now, we're showing Swedfund. And here on the top of the page, you'll see analysis. And then if you scroll down, you'll see specific recommendations. And finally, if you scroll to the bottom, you will see a deep dive section where each institution's performance can be analyzed indicator by indicator. So each of the institutions know exactly what they scored, where they stand, what they need to do to improve. So now we're going to talk about the transparency of non-sovereign DFIs. So before I start ranting, I want to acknowledge, first and foremost, the positive relationships that we have with the technical teams in most of these institutions. Our engagement with them has been genuine, pragmatic, constructive, and in many cases, they've worked extremely hard to improve disclosure since 2023. But making systematic improvement requires not just technical teams. Where we've seen real improvements is when the technical work is supported by leadership. But by now, it's clear that the biggest problem we have relates to the transparency of non-sovereign DFIs. Our index highlights that even basic information relating to co-financing, concessionality, private capital mobilization isn't being shared. Yet DFIs have a mandate to build markets, and markets aren't built in silence. To build markets, you need to share data, including risk, returns, impact, deal structures, etc. If you claim to be pioneering in these markets, then you really need to share your maps. Otherwise, don't expect anyone to follow you. Private sector DFIs already understand this. That's why they pay for access to third-party data sets on emerging market deals, data sets which they themselves don't actually contribute to. They also understand the power of data not least because of the example of ILX, the only firm to gain wholesale access to the MDB's secretive GEMS database, who have since used that information to mobilize billions in investment. DFIs know that data gaps distort perceptions of risk in the global south, pushing up borrowing costs and deterring investment. The private sector knows this, the credit ratings know this, they've all been very clear, they've said they need more, better, disaggregated data. So why aren't DFIs sharing it? They cite commercial confidentiality, but that's largely of their own making, the result of restrictive NDAs and contracts that they design. And while those contracts could be changed for future deals, no DFI appears willing to do that at the moment. They cite banking regulations, valid occasionally and worthy of exemption. They cite safety concerns for their investees, again, rare, but manageable. They say clients don't want the data shared, but every client we've spoken to has said otherwise. And in fact, the clients are often the ones telling us that the lack of sharing of data makes it increasingly difficult for the private sector to enter these markets. So what's really going on? Is it a reluctance to be scrutinized, a desire for an easier life? Are DFIs trying to minimize competition? It's hardly a secret that DFIs compete with each other and with the very private sector they often claim to mobilize. Or is it incentives are they more incentivized to favor the deployment of their own capital over external mobilization? Or is it culture? After all, how often have we been told that these institutions are really just private banks? And what does all this mean for the future? So next week, it's FFD4. the Financing for Development Conference, MDBs play a major role in the outcome document, just as they did 10 years ago at FFD3. And in the decade since, MDBs have reportedly mobilized around $700 billion in private finance. But we can't see the detail that sits behind that. We don't know how those deals were structured. We don't know what levels of subsidy was involved, how much public finance required, what the impact was, because non-sovereign DFIs are not disclosing that information. Yes, slowly improvements are being made. The GEMS database, for example, has recently improved and disclosed more information, but only after years and years of pushing. And all the while, investors have been clear that they still need more detail. They need recovery rates, they need project level risk, they need actual track records. This lack of disclosure has inflated borrowing costs, stunted markets, and makes it extremely unlikely we will close the SDG financing gap. So the status quo is not working. Keeping data locked away keeping data locked away isn't leading to trillions of dollars in investment. It's holding progress back. There are willing investors that want to invest in emerging economies, but lack of disclosure is blocking their participation at the scale that is needed. So before I hand over to Hans-Peter, I need to say a huge thank you to the Publish What You Fund team, Paul, Ryan, Ella, Sally, and Sam. It's been an enormous lift, not just arranging this launch, but the past 2 years of research and engagement with DFIs and other stakeholders. And finally, a huge thank you to the ODI global team, Ben, Megan, Sam, Hans-Peter, for partnering with us for this event. To conclude, the 2025 index shows progress, but also that we're not where we need to be. The baseline is clearer now and the roadmap is in place. The challenge ahead is not technical, it's political, it's cultural, but above all, it needs leadership. DFIs are being asked to do more with less, and as ODA falls and climate needs grow, the pressure is rising. But without transparency, we're all having to steer through complexity without a map. Transparency is not a compliance exercise. It's fundamental to the mission of these organizations. It's fundamental to the work of our sector, and it's fundamental to the goals of FFD4. It's what allows us to build trust, evaluate impact, and unlock capital at scale. So to our partners in the DFI world, thank you for your efforts so far. We encourage you to go further. To the shareholders, civil society groups, and researchers here today, use this report to hold these institutions accountable and help us push for the data we all need to drive better decisions and better outcomes. Thank you.
Very good. That was a great presentation, Gary. I hadn't fully realized that we were essentially going to be sitting on the hot seat here. But that's what it is. You know, you show us the index, you show us where we're falling short, and then especially Maria and Lisandro are going to have to justify where they are. But I also know now why we have Lisandro and Maria here, because they did particularly well. So hopefully
it's sold this way.
Hopefully, yeah, there's more to do. There's more to do. Yeah, and Vicky and David with us here on the screen. So before I turn to the four of them, and I have sort of a series of questions, then perhaps a bit out of script, let me just make a couple of intro comments. And it's kind of prompted by what you said, Gary, about the importance of transparency as kind of fundamental to the mission. And I just want to say one thing. Last week, I was at a workshop of the G20 on the cost of capital. And one of the big items in that discussion is information, is data, always comes back up. And what you said, that the information gaps are contributing to uncertainty. Well, the uncertainty contributes to the cost of capital, and that is very well established and was sort of one of the major themes that we had. And therefore also, I hope that we get out of this South African G20 process a very, very strong call for transparency, for information, and the MDBs, the DFIs, have a particularly important role to play in that context. So there's an actual cost to not delivering on transparency. And one could even go and quantify that. So there have been people who quantified what sort of credit ratings, for instance, are costing Africa, right? And you could go and do the same and try to establish how much the absence of information is costing Africa. And there, one thing which is kind of interesting from the overview that you provide is how heterogeneous the provision of information is. So you highlighted IFU on the impact side, but then IFU comes in the aggregate, very low down the scale. So why transparent on one issue and not on the other? And the same is true when you go through. Why is one institution feeling that it cannot report on something and the other one has no problem with it? And I think that at the core of it is that transparency is not defined as a product, as a mandate product by these institutions. We, and I've been most of my life in these institutions, never saw the provision of data from our own experience, basically, as a key product of the institution. It's the projects, it's the money, it's the TA, it's whatever, but not the data. Because if it were, then they would organize themselves around it, and you wouldn't get this kind of dog's meal of transparency. Anyway, just wanted to throw that in there. And with that, let me turn to our panel, and first to Maria. Maria, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for sitting on the hot seat.
Yes.
And maybe you would just want to say something briefly about BII, about what you do,
Yep.
and then tell us, how you've done to make this kind of progress this year.
So hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me even to the hot seat. I'm Maria Smith, and I'm the Chief Impact Officer at British International Investment. So we are the UK Development Finance Institution. We are investing in the private sector in Africa and South Asia in order to grow more productive, sustainable, and inclusive economies that we operate in. Because we're a DFI and because of who our shareholder is and who our stakeholders are, impact is what we do, and transparency is our responsibility, and we do take that seriously. And I think it's also our responsibility to show that we are a learning institution, and so that we don't always get it right, but that we are learning and evolving throughout what we do, and that is in our DNA. But I would say when the initial report came out in 2023, I think it was a wake-up call for us. And we had some questions, from the International Development Committee and therefore from all of our stakeholders. And, I think it really opened our eyes that we had a journey to do to make improvements. And we took that very seriously. So we committed to trying to be the most transparent bilateral DFI. So we're very happy with these results. And I think there's three key things that we did to make that happen over the last 2 or 3 years. As Gary said, it really does start from the top. So I think the first most important thing we did is we established a working group, a transparency working group that was made up of senior representatives at BII. We created an actual roadmap, so that had milestones in terms of what we wanted to do in order to make improvements across the various categories. And we hired a dedicated transparency and disclosure officer who's sitting here in this room and is largely responsible for many of the improvements that we've made. So this is what we did tangibly. What I would say is it's still a journey. So, we're very happy with the results, but we also are very cognizant of the areas which, by the way, the website and I think the way things are illustrated does give you a very good heat map as to where our weaknesses are, compared to others. And, we'll be continued to focus on those because we know there's more to do.
Thanks a lot, Maria. And without turning to Lisandro, you're the Director of Outcomes Measurement in the World Bank Group, and you cover not just the IBRD, but you cover the IFC, so the non-sovereign part as well, and you cover MIGA, and you have delivered a big change on the scorecards in the World Bank Group. Maybe you tell us a little bit about what you have done and then how you managed to be where you are on this.
Thank you, Hans-Peter and Gary, for inviting us. I think I'm very happy to be here. We will see that at the end. I am the director, actually, Hans-Peter's, for outcomes at the World Bank Group, and I actually like to emphasize the work for, because thankfully I'm not responsible for delivering all the outcomes of the World Bank Group, but for creating the conditions that actually facilitate the achievement of outcomes. And 4 symbolizes that. And I think we see my job at the bank as doing what I call embedding an outcome reflex in everything that we do. And it's basically thinking instinctively in every decision to focus on outcomes, as opposed to focus on outcomes at the very end when we need to measure what we have achieved. So in the last couple of years, or in the last year and a half, one key thing that we have done that I think is recognized in the ranking is the introduction of what we call the World Bank Group scorecard, that it's a tool that allows us to aggregate the impact of our operations, but does so in a very transparent manner. So when we were building the scorecard, we said, let's build a scorecard that embraces radical transparency. And that is, while in the past you were able to see the results of the World Bank Group at the very aggregate level and have numbers of the number of children that, for example, were vaccinated or accessed education without seeing the underlying numbers, we moved to a situation where now you can drill down and go all the way to the project and community level, and then have a methodology that allows you to reproduce those numbers exactly the same way in which we did it. And then when you have a system like that, it really sends very strong signals to our clients, but also within the institution. If you focus on the scorecard, the results and the visibility follow. If you don't, they won't. And I would say, to close this part, Peter, is that it is working. And in the sense what we are seeing only a year after the scorecard was introduced, that we're seeing close to 90% of our new operations being aligned with the scorecard priorities, while a year before we were at less than 50%. So only in 1 year, we're seeing that it's working as a tool of selectivity and as a tool of directing the institution to key priorities. And secondly, and most importantly, we're seeing a raise in ambition. So when you make results clear and available to everyone, teams focus a lot on making sure that they deliver results that are impactful. And if I give you an example that I think is very interesting, a year before the scorecard, our health portfolio, the new operations approved in fiscal year 23, we're aiming to reach 100 million people with health packages and health services. And then a year after the scorecard, that number for operations approved this fiscal year is 91 million. So really a significant increase. And part of that, we like to claim it to the fact that it's been transparent and generating the right incentives and the right action. So that gives you a sense of what we have.
Yeah, and having been at the World Bank group when there were 150 or so scorecard measures, one thing that you can see very clearly is that being more selective helps you to focus and to manage. If you try to measure too much, you end up measuring nothing and managing for nothing. Could you just briefly comment on 2 indicators that you have in the scorecard? Yeah, Lisandro, and that's on private capital mobilization and private capital enablement. So there is sort of a group of aficionados here that of private capital mobilization. It's a very interesting concept, but you're not really measuring it yet, are you?
I tell you what we're doing. So, and you would say whether we are or not. So when we launched the scorecard, I think one thing that was very clear for us, it takes a lot of effort. And, one of the things on transparency is not that it's a resource-free endeavor in a way. So we need to focus on a lot of issues that are strategic, but also on a lot of issues that are nitty-gritty and time-consuming. And sometimes when you were talking about having a dedicated person, I think sometimes these organizations have a lot of inertia as well, unless you have somebody focused on really making the changes. So when we decided to launch the scorecard, we did it with the principle that better done than perfect, as Ajay Banga usually says. And then we launched the scorecard with 20 of the 22 indicators that we were intending to measure. 2 were left outside. That was the private capital enabling and the jobs indicator. The good thing is that in the next release of the scorecard that is happening next October at the time of the annual meetings, the private capital enabling one is going to be available with a reproducible methodology and with the data. So for the first time, will be the first MDB that is going to have this data available and a methodology for all of you to hopefully reproduce our numbers. In the case of private capital mobilization, we did produce those numbers for the last scorecard, and I think you can drill down even to the project level, and that's the same thing that you will see for the PCE. I think the big change that we're introducing as we move forward is that we realize that having ex ante numbers that we calculate when we design operations, it's a good thing and a good step, but numbers change over time. And I'm a big aficionado also of behavioral economics, and I know we all have an optimism bias when we do operations. So very often, the numbers that you estimate at design tend to be a bit lower at the end. So starting in the midterm review of the scorecard that is already happening next year, we have committed that these indicators are also going to give you an ex post view. So we're going to come back and say, this is what we actually have delivered from what we thought at the beginning of the operation. So in my view, quite a lot of progress. There's still a lot to do, but I think we're going in the direction where you will be increasingly pleased with the results that you will be seeing.
That's excellent. And then we're going to start seeing it showing up at BII as well. And everybody else.
That's the
So
idea.
with that, I want to turn to David, who is hovering over us here. David McNair is the Executive Director of the One Campaign. And perhaps David could just first briefly introduce the One Campaign and what your focus is when it comes to DFIs and MDBs.
Thanks, Hans-Peter. At the One Campaign, we've been running now for 20 years, and our focus is advocating and mobilizing citizen voices to make the case for economic opportunities and healthy lives. So it emerged out of the Jubilee Debt Campaign. We did a lot to convince the Bush administration to create PEPFAR, and more recently, working very closely with Hans-Peter and other colleagues at ODI, we've been working on the CAF agenda, better leveraging the balance sheets of MDBs. We've been working on transparency and cost of capital issues. So we're trying to kind of convert the kind of storytelling and translation of these issues and trying to make them intelligible to policymakers who might not have a lot of technical knowledge or a lot of time, but then also bring citizen voices behind pushing for these things. And transparency is fundamental to all of that.
Thanks. And just continuing from that, David, what is it when we talk about transparency that you're looking for at the One Campaign? What are you pushing for?
Well, I mean, if we think about this year, it's really been a wake-up call for our sector, and I feel like a lot of us are going through the stages of grief. You know, initially it was denial, and then anger and acceptance, and as we kind of emerge from the fog of that, I think we need to learn that if we can't build constituencies and tell stories about why our sector matters, then we're going to lose support. And that applies to development institutions, it applies to overall funding budgets, and it applies to DFIs. Because I think, as someone recently said to me, people in rich countries no longer feel rich and no longer feel an obligation to the poor. So we need to be able to tell stories of impact for return on investment, not just in terms of it being a nice thing to do or a kind of charitable enterprise, but actually this is making all of us safer. And we saw the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability play out over the last 6 months or so. You know, when Elon Musk can kind of come out and tell stories about massive fraud and corruption, our sector didn't really have an adequate response to that. And I saw this myself a few weeks ago whenever my boss, Bono, went on the Joe Rogan podcast and talked about this study from Boston University showing that, or estimating at least, that 300,000 lives had been lost as a result of the USAID cuts. In response to that, Elon Musk tweeted his millions of followers saying this is a load of rubbish. And in a sense, we could talk about modeling studies, but we couldn't actually kind of present robust data to say, actually, here's the impact that this institution was having, and these cuts have resulted in this impact. And I think we need to learn that lesson, because unless we can be telling those stories, then the lack of transparency could be a matter of survival for our institutions. But more than that, I mean, now that we are in this position and concessional finance has declined dramatically, we need to be looking at ways of mobilizing other forms of capital and unlocking efficiencies. And as you said, Hans-Peter, you know, this work on cost of capital, you know, so much of it is driven by a lack of information. But if we could get this right through, you know, reforms to methodologies, better transparency, disclosure of data, we could be unlocking tens of billions every year to invest in development, both on the sovereign and on the private side, at no cost to any donor, you know, with limited impact, increases in taxation and so on. So I think the fact that we're now in a more frugal environment forces us to say we need to align the incentives of the people making decisions about transparency with the people who, are going to, benefit from this disclosure, and also the political leaders who, at a stroke of a pen, could be, cutting these things dramatically. So the world has changed and we need to change with it. And I think transparency needs to be a fundamental part of that.
Thanks, David. That really powerful message there. It's really about the narrative that justifies the existence of these institutions, right? And so the data are more than just a compliance issue. They are about the core of their mission. With that, I would want to turn to Wiki T. I hope I pronounced this correctly.
Yeah, Wiki T, that's correct.
Wiki is the portfolio manager for the development finance and impact credit section at Allianz Global Investors. I'm very glad that you joined us with a perspective from the private sector here. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit of what Allianz Global Investors is doing
Sure.
in this area, in the space, DFIs, MDBs.
Sure, very happy to. Very happy to. So my name is Wiki. Again, for ease of remembering, it's like the wiki in Wikipedia, fountain of knowledge, but up to you to believe. No. But getting back to the topic at hand. So Allianz Global Investors, we are a global asset manager with a presence worldwide. We are owned by Allianz, the insurance company headquartered in Germany, but also with an equally large presence globally. We have over 500 billion euros in assets under management, last I checked, of which about 17 to 20% of that is in private markets. Now, within private markets, it's roughly split between private debt and private equity fairly evenly, and I include the infra private equity and the infra private credit within those buckets as well. And my team, which is the development finance and impact credit investment team, sits within the private debt bucket of the private markets platform. So we started out in 2017 as an emerging market private credit focused investment team. And currently we manage various emerging market debt funds and strategies, some which incorporate blending, so blended funds, and some which do not incorporate blending, i.e. just clean direct lending across emerging markets. We've used blending as a way to really mobilize private sector capital at scale, as a way to really de-risk the structures, to allow our investors, which are currently mostly European investors, to invest in riskier neighborhoods, so to speak. And that has been fairly successful as a strategy. The other way that we focus on de-risking is by partnering with the DFIs and the MDBs, as they have a very established track record in lending in EM, with relatively low default rates and relatively high recovery rates when you compare to, similarly rated high yield investments in developed markets. And so that has been a result of their preferred creditor status, the strong underwriting standards and presence in local markets, which we liked. And so when we went into EM investing for the first time, we thought that partnership with them would be very helpful to give our investors comfort when going into a new asset class. Just to finish off the picture, within our team as well, we manage an impact private credit strategy, which at the moment is a pure play impact investing strategy focused in Europe and is SFDR Article 9.
Great, thank you. And could you tell us, there's a lot of hopes riding on private credit these days. It's a quickly growing asset class,
Yeah.
and there's sort of a sense that this is perhaps the way to go if we want to bring larger amounts of capital into emerging markets. What role does information play there? Private credit is probably more information heavy than public markets.
Exactly.
But tell us, what role does it play? What role do the DFIs and their information play in your ability to invest?
Sure. And I would say that actually, to clarify, across public markets and private markets, the amount of information that we need is fairly the same. The issue is that in private markets, it's so opaque, and there's no database where we can go and access and we can see, returns automatically, and also ESG data. It's all there in one place. It's all, provided by providers and standardized. It's not the same for private markets. And hence we do have to do a lot more digging as a private credit investment team to get that information, to ensure that we do our due diligence comprehensively to get to the investment decision and finally deploy the capital. or not. So that's the distinction I would say between public markets and private markets. But in terms of information that is valuable to us, at the end of the day, financial performance data and returns data still remain the key things that private sector investors want to see, because it doesn't matter if you're allocating to developed markets or to emerging markets, those two things need to be satisfied from their perspective before they make an allocation. And so looking at like financial performance data and track record like NPLs, default rates, recovery rates, how they look like. That's very important for us before being able to invest or being able to convince asset owners to invest. Returns data like what's the weighted average portfolio spread and how does that compare versus public benchmarks, because if this is private credit, surely I need to have some sort of illiquidity premium to make sense of the lack of transferability for my instrument. So those are the types of information that institutional investors would require in order to make a decision to invest. And apart from that, and this is something that I've seen more recently in the past few years, for example, when we upsized our blended debt fund, which is a partnership between Allianz and the IFC, from 556 million to 1.1 billion under the IFC's One Planet program, is that essentially ESG data, especially principal adverse impact data that's required under SFDR, is super important for institutional investors. And at the time, I remember having these conversations with IFC in 2022 to try to explain what SFDR was, which fair enough, you wouldn't not come across it if you're not a regulated institution in Europe. But that conversation, and I know the IFC, for example, has come a long way in terms of what they disclose on their underlying investments to us. But ESG data like that becomes very important for us to have, for investors to then satisfy their reporting requirements to the regulators as well. So I'll finish off by saying that more recently, climate finance and impact KPIs have become of more importance for institutional investors. A lot of the conversations we're having around fundraising right now include that as to, whether you can achieve a certain target percentage of climate finance within your portfolio, and whether or not you're going to get the data from the underlying investments. That has become into much focus. And so that's something that we're trying to, whenever we speak to MDBs and DFIs, where we source investments from, that, hey, can you give us this data so that we can ultimately aggregate and disclose to our investors as well. Maybe one point that I wanted to say on the back of what Lisandro just mentioned is that for that World Bank Group scorecard, it would be super helpful is if that you could pick and choose. Let's say the IFC has so many different MCPP programs, and there are different investors that come into that. If you could almost like tailor the underlying investments, then you see the scorecard within that for that portfolio for the respective investors. That would be super useful as a tool, actually, and something that we interested to hear from our side. Given our fund with the IFC, for example, is only looking at IFC loans. So maybe that could be something to talk about after this panel. So anyway.
Thanks, Vicky. Just don't want you to change the dynamics that I've written up here. So I wanted to turn now to 4 topics and sort of rapid insights from you. The one topic is impact and results. The second is climate finance. The third is private capital mobilization. And the fourth is MDB reform. And I would just perhaps if we start with impact, Maria, could you give us a sense of what your impact measurement agenda is and how do you see it evolving, including with regard to transparency?
So we're in our current strategic framework, which goes through the end of this year. We've created an impact framework that helps us solve what is a complex puzzle, right? Because we are investing across sectors, everything from infrastructure, financial services, just like the World Bank, right? And services businesses. We're in 64 markets. We're in lots of different types of products, from debt, equity, concessional capital. So we have a portfolio tool that we've built that allows us ex ante, before investment, to score each of the investments we have from an impact perspective across 3 of our key themes, which is productivity, sustainability, and inclusivity. And so what this does, and it's been fantastic in helping us inform investment decision making, because it allows us to allocate our capital to these 3 themes and where we see that we can get the most impact. And we publish on our website for every investment what that ex ante score is. 2 years after every investment, we rescore to see if we've done what we thought we were going to do. And we also, this is the first year that we've scored because we've had 2 years of data, but we will be posting also our ex post scoring. So that will be achieved. Now, under that, because that is a portfolio tool, we obviously also have an impact dashboard and unique indicators that we look at for each transaction in each project. The narrative of the dashboard is published on the website. I think where we probably have more work to do is during the lifetime of the investment is, could we disclose more indicators? And that's one of the things we're looking at. But what we do is after we've exited, we put impact achieved. And you can find that disclosed, which is what are the actual indicators and metrics that we looked at that we achieved during the lifetime of the investment. I'd say the other thing that we do, which is probably relevant, is often funded by our shareholder FCDO, we do these evaluations. I mean, this is all in the spirit of us being a learning institution. And we do some of them which are sectorial. So financial services is our largest sector of our portfolio. And so actually just this year, we published a multi-year evaluation on our financial services portfolio. And also this has been incredibly useful because now that we're looking forward to our next strategy period, we're using the recommendations from that to inform the new strategy. And we will be disclosing exactly what we learned and how that's changing our pathway going forward.
Great. I have to say, impact reporting is a tricky thing. So for instance, at the IFC, we had this system of measuring and putting a number on it. So you would be reporting, we achieved 56.
Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Last year it was 54.
Yeah.
So since it's by nature, overwhelmingly something qualitative, how do you capture that in a way that is reportable and comparable? And it's interesting. The World Bank scorecard is trying to do that, right? So with a qualitative and a quantitative dimension. So just a.
We also do post a narrative about the impact, through the dashboard. But I mean, I think the next step is quantifying the indicator. And one of the things we're trying to do in the next strategy period is move away from a more project-based impact analysis and more towards systems or markets effects. And I think the more you move towards that, the more you can also have collective indicators that are easier to tell the story.
And compare across institutions. I'm doing a terrible job as a moderator, by the way. It's we're falling totally behind. So Vicky, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Very quickly, from your perspective, what is the role in private investment of this kind of impact and results reporting? Is it important for you? Do you need that info? Do your investors look for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And maybe I'll start with an example. And this touches on the impact private credit strategy I mentioned earlier when I gave my introduction. Now, as I mentioned, it's an SFDR Article 9 strategy. And right now it's focused in Europe, but we have had quite a success in terms of fundraising for that strategy. We raised 560 million euros last year when we did our first close. And for our fourth close earlier this year, it was at 705. And we're looking to do another close soon. And it was against a backdrop of quite a difficult and volatile fundraising market. But I think what really made it stand out was the fact that it was very impact-led. It was a very impact-led thesis. I mean, private credit funds, you see so many in the market, but a lot of the investors that we engaged with, they liked it because it was very impact driven. We had the ability to collect impact KPIs on all the investments and say, hey, we're going to aggregate it. You'll be able to see it in an annual impact report. And I think that resonated strongly with a lot of investors. Now, it's not the same necessarily for what we do on the EM side because it's in Europe, it's a different jurisdiction, but I think having the ability to tell your investor, we will collect impact KPIs on all investments and we will disclose it to you is quite a powerful message. And some of these investors, which we had co-created, it was a collaborative process with them when we were creating the fund, have emerging market allocations as well. And so they do have impact teams that see the value of having this data collected. Now, currently, for our EM strategies, what we do see is quite popular, or what investors look for is SDG contribution. I think that's usually quite a good metric that they look for because it's easy to see then how that compares versus the funding gap that's present and how much you're doing to kind of bridge that gap. Apart from that, as I mentioned, climate finance is also an important aspect that they're starting to look at. So the percentage of your portfolio which is deemed as climate finance, and also is that mitigation, is that adaptation? They want to know these types of things. And so that type of information, if we could have that, is very important. But I will have to say that there is still a lot of focus from them on the ESG data collection side. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of heterogeneous data being collected from EM, and there is difficulty in classifying some of our funds with DFIs as Article 9, because we can't hand on heart say that we can collect all the data and we're able to do the sustainable investment assessment to say that, you know, at least 80% of the fund will be sustainable investments. We know that you're doing something really good and powerful on the ground, and when we did the due diligence on you, we know you have the best ESG standards, we know you have impact system, but if we're not collecting the data that we need for the regulation, unfortunately, we can't say that you're going to be Article 9, for example. And that matters a lot for certain investors. I won't say all investors, but certain investors, it does make a difference as to whether or not they decide to invest or not.
Yes, SFDR 9, I think is almost impossible to meet, right? And there's a bit of a discussion about that.
Yes, unless you use estimates. Yeah.
That brings us to climate finance and a question around that. So the index is now measuring transparency around climate finance disclosure. And one issue which you find here, as you find in so many other areas, is the lack of project level information, which of course the general community can be quite interested in. With that, David, can you tell us a little bit about what the One campaign would like to see on the climate finance side, and you know, why I think you've been calling for harmonization of methodologies, etc. Why is that important?
Well, a couple of years ago, we had a simple question. We wanted to ask, you know, whether, you know, the commitments made and announced, you know, the 100 billion and so on, were actually adding up to support to vulnerable countries to support their response to climate change. And we dug into the data. You know, we reviewed thousands of projects. We looked at what donors were claiming were climate finance, particularly under the DAC definitions. And we find pretty much a wild west. Nearly 2/3 of climate finance commitment counted by the OECD either weren't recorded as dispersed, or they had little to do with climate finance. And we had all kinds of examples. You know, the most fascinating was a chain of gelato shops, which the Italian government had claimed was their response to climate adaptation. But there were all kinds of examples. And I think, you know, the fact that you don't have this kind of standardization, you know, watchdogs, you know, systems in place to evaluate this, means that, you know, the level of trust, particularly from countries in the global south, and we saw what was playing out in the NCQG negotiations over the past couple of years. Like, there's very little trust that this money is real, that it's materializing. And in a context where the needs are increasing dramatically and concessional finance is more limited, we need to know that it's going in, you know, to the most impactful programs. And how does that apply to DFIs? I think, you know, DFIs, you know, if you think about the general public, you know, they're, you know, in a sense, they are giving the mandate to these institutions, and their understanding of development and aid is, you know, very, very, you know, simple. You know, they understand humanitarian crises, they understand, you know, food trucks going, like, the concept of a DFI is like very, very esoteric. And I think we need to be able to say, okay, you know, this is a complex system, but what we're doing here is creating markets, creating jobs, like, you know, to the earlier point, this isn't just project level stuff. This is adding up to a systemic impact, which isn't just about the DFI justifying its own existence. It's also about the incentives that are created for the system to have those impacts that show that, you know, to the citizens of the countries where the investments are made, that this is actually, you know, delivering climate resilience and economic transformation. And for the citizens of those countries that are the investors, you know, donor countries, that this is about economic transformation that creates trading partners, that creates future economic growth and resilience, and isn't just about a kind of what often is perceived to be an endless stream of charitable finance with no return for the people that give it. So I know that's kind of, we're in a very kind of technical discussion, but I think it's useful to kind of step back to the big picture and kind of think like, what is all of this for? Because if we don't ask those questions, then the mandate that we have to do our work will diminish.
Yes, it is. Thank you, David. And I'm rushing forward to Lisandro. The World Bank has done reasonably well on the climate finance indicator. It's still somewhat aggregated. So can you tell us a bit about plans for disaggregation? How many gelato shops are you financing?
Right. In fact, that's good. I was planning to talk about gelato instead of climate, but maybe I link it. So clearly, we've done, I think, good progress, but a lot remains to be done. And before, Hans-Peter, you were asking about PCM and now climate. And I think I wanted to start by saying that both of them are very important to the way that we conceive development in the World Bank and to the work that I do that is about outcomes, because both are about results that endure, I think, over time, and whether tested development is exactly what we want to see, that is inclusive. So very important to think carefully about how we communicate the finance. Three things that we are trying to start doing and hopefully will add to this conversation. Number one is that we understand that having numbers that are at the overall aggregate and project level do not give you the full story of development. If you are doing a big transport project, you want to know what is the component within that project that really contributes to mitigation as opposed to the overall project. So we have already started to offer data on the subcomponent level in our projects. Started on April 1st. If you go to our website, there are already around 30 operations for which you can see that cut down. But by the day, we are adding additional information in each of the operations that are being approved on how much the overall project mobilizes, but also how much that happens at the subcomponent level. Second important point for us is that, as I was saying before, the intentions at the beginning of an operation really sometimes due to reality change at the end, and all of the numbers that you see in the world on climate finance are ex ante numbers. And then what we are doing starting on July 1st is going ex post as well and revisiting our models and really giving you a better sense of what has been delivered. This is not only for the climate benefits and finance itself, but we're also going to do that for our contribution to GHG emission reduction. So again, the MDBs give you the aggregate numbers at the beginning of an operation. We're going to go back and see whether those models can be updated with information that comes directly exposed from project implementation. We think this is not only useful externally and for all of you and do the work to hold institutions like ours and also governments accountable. But I was saying to you at the beginning that part of my work is to make sure that we bring outcomes earlier in the results chain, earlier in the project cycle, and therefore more granular information that is more tested by reality, I think is very important for us to fine tune and make more course corrections towards the outcomes. And then the final point that I highlight here, it's about trying to become more systematic and thorough about how we assess and apply the climate finance methodology. And we are increasingly using a lot of AI tools to really check that the human judgments that we have across operations can actually be better standardized and checked by the systems themselves. So as opposed to maybe going to AI and the humans checking, what we're going to see is trying to see whether AI help us also make sure that our thinking is consistent across different operations. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, and I hope we'll hear from Kim in the discussion about how to use AI tools for all of this. And so one of the nice things of being in a think tank now is that you can say all sorts of things you wouldn't otherwise. So I mean, there's a climate finance working group among the MDBs. I hope that these kinds of points that you're just making and progress is being shared with colleagues from across the MDB and DFI community. Mm-hmm. With that, I would like to turn to Wiki on this point of private capital mobilization, and you've touched upon it, especially the question of the granularity of the information, which today is lacking. So we lack this project level information on the extent to which DFIs have been able to mobilize private capital. So question to you, Wiki, this is often justified. So the absence of this information is often justified by confidentiality concerns, right? Which is true for many other areas, by the way, of transparency of the DFIs in particular. So client confidentiality. Now, you are the private sector. How concerned are you about this confidentiality issue? Is that something you feel is could be overcome?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I will just start off by saying I don't think I can speak for the whole private sector. No, but I think personally, based on also experience, I feel that there will be a willingness to be part of that disclosure, for private capital mobilization ratios if ultimately it helps with greater mobilization to emerging markets, for development, etc. One thing I would say that it needs to be on a anonymized basis, so like a no name basis. You can say like, these insurance companies, investors, these pension funds mobilized, were brought into certain transactions by the MDBs, DFIs in these regions, etc. But not naming the investors directly is quite important, because if you do name them, sometimes it negates the beauty of the sub-participation structure, which a lot of these investors like to go into when co-investing with the DFIs, because with that, you're not necessarily seen to the borrower. I mean, they might know that there is a sub-participation, but to the wider market as well, they may not necessarily know that who exactly these participants are, and that helps to mitigate one of the risks that investors have with investing into EM, and that is reputational risks. Now, I think the beauty of the B loan sub-participation structure is that investors can mobilize at scale and can go into all these different deals, but not necessarily have their name thrown out everywhere, investing to XYZ. And that helps in case of any sort of like maybe reputational risk issue that has happened in a single deal. You don't automatically be thrown into the dirt from a public perspective, even though you might be working through it in the background with the borrower. And that has happened actually on a real life example, and where the compliance teams and investors took comfort that we were named publicly. But in terms of saying that, this insurance company is invested alongside DFI, I think that's not going to be an issue in terms of disclosing that. I want to maybe draw upon also the confidentiality when it comes to like project level information, because sometimes even in funds which some of our investors are invested into, some of the project level information is not allowed to be disclosed to them from the DFIs, even though they're invested directly into the funds, and say like, no, you cannot share ratings information. That's very sensitive, only on an aggregate level. But, I think we need to be able to overcome some of those confidentiality restrictions that are quoted to us by MDBs when it comes to the underlying borrowers agreeing to share the information or not. I think a lot of the borrowers will have a willingness and will agree to share that information with us as the ultimate investors. But I think sometimes based on our previous conversations with certain DFIs, they're saying like, no, you can only, mention that to your ultimate investors in a aggregate basis. I think if we can overcome that, it helps with future things like rating blended funds as well in the future, for us to have this granular data from an investor standpoint. And I think that's something that we could definitely work through together with the DFI community. But just wanted to end on that point.
Thanks for this very nuanced response, and I think it's really genuinely useful to hear that. It would be good to to make that argument more generally. And with that, let me just ask, so IDB Invest, I think, is the one institution that at this point provides the most granular PCM information. Is that correct? Yeah. And so they somehow found it possible to go further than most. Now, BII, the new CEO, has been developing strategy for BII, and private mobilization, capital mobilization, plays a very big role in that, right? So I think if there's one headline, it's really about private capital mobilization. So how are you going to address this question? So you heard transparency can actually help to mobilize.
100%. I mean, look, I think why IDB probably has been so successful is they've been so focused, incentivized as an organization on mobilization, right? This is what they do. They do it the best. I mean, it's incredible. We're learning from them. I mean, we're trying to learn from them. We have not, it hasn't been a key KPI for BII historically. And so it is in the future. Definitely there's going to be a sharpened focus on mobilization. And so we need to sharpen our tools is the answer. I mean, we will be learning from IDB Invest. We will, I mean, again, I think another follow-up, like would love to talk to you further, but we are out there trying to talk to all of the types of investors that we want to mobilize and saying, what do you need to see, you know, both from a risk perspective, from a credit quality perspective, returns and data, and we'll be listening to that, and then it'll require an underhaul, you know, like how we do our legals, how we talk to our investees, but we will be prioritizing it because we will be we will be focused on mobilization more going forward. So this, I mean, I think watch the space. This is definitely an area for us that we know we need to make improvement, but we also know it's necessary to mobilize.
I just want to say that BII has agreed to share climate and impact data on deals that they'll syndicate to us for our upcoming blended fund. So that is a positive step in the right direction.
Good. That's good
Want
to
to
hear.
mention that.
That's great. So time is running. And we have one more topic here, which is MDB reform. So maybe just 1 minute each, David and Lisandro, on this topic. MDB reform has been sort of a major initiative over the past 3-4 years. And I know all the institutions are kind of involved in this at this point. The G20 is pushing very heavily. And I know the one campaign, David, has been a quite important public voice in this context. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you're trying to achieve and what role transparency plays in that context?
Sure, thanks, Peter. I mean, if we look at going back to the Strongway Stern report and the gap that we have when it comes to finance needs for the energy transition and for sustainable development, I think it was 2.4 trillion for emerging markets excluding China, and MDBs are the game in town, I think, for mobilizing this kind of scale of resources. And so we did a lot of work, going back to the Indonesian G20, the Indian G20 on the capital adequacy framework that Hans-Peter, you were heavily involved in, to try and better leverage the balance sheets of MDBs. And I think that's unlocked about 400 billion in lending headroom. Now, I don't know how much of that has actually been delivered, but it's a pretty powerful message that when you can have a clear agenda, that report had 5 very clear recommendations. There was a civil society mobilization behind it. And, we managed to get a lot of the shareholders of the major MDBs, to back this effort. I think now that we're in a situation where, the US administration has changed and the US Treasury Secretary is so fundamental to these reforms, we're in a kind of moment where we're thinking through, which are the institutions that could reform? Where are the opportunities for taking this forward? And I think there is an agenda around leveraging special drawing rights as part of hybrid capital instruments to capitalize MDBs. But ultimately, these are institutions that, and Ajay Banga's, FT op-ed a couple of months ago was kind of really clear on this. The way in which they have taken relatively small amounts of paid-in capital and leveraged, huge amounts of low-cost capital for investment in infrastructure and human development is really, impressive, and we need more of that. So at this point, a lot of our coalitions are kind of trying to think through how can we almost minimize the risk of these institutions and the progress they have made being attacked. But ultimately, we do need a forward-looking progressive agenda on how we can get more from MDB finance, leverage the balance sheets more effectively, and do so in a way that is faster. And I know that's part of the World Bank's reform agenda. One anecdote that I found quite funny was a former boss of mine was talking to an African president who said that if he asks the Chinese to build a road, he will be driving down it in the time that it takes the World Bank to sign the contract. And that was a few years ago, and I think those things are improving. But we need to kind of, make sure that those stories aren't stories that can be told in the future.
Great. Thanks, David. And 30 seconds because in principle, Lisandro, you've already commented on this before, but basically same question. World Bank has been, very central to the whole MDB reform process. What are the next steps there, and is transparency part of that?
Great. I mean, Hans-Peter, maybe really in 30 seconds, what I would say is that perhaps an area, if we think about the future of transparency, an area where we need to, in a way, focus on is what I would call maybe transparency 360, that allows all of the MDBs to really put out their outcome data, that allows you and everybody that is following these reforms to really assess whether we are effective as a system or not. At the moment, all of us continue playing soloist, I think, and maybe it's time for us to realize the dream of when we were teenagers and join a band and really make music together. And I think from the impact perspective, that is what we see. I think eventually what we want to see is citizens, NGOs, and advocates really making sure that they understand how we all contribute to the same pie. And I think while a lot of progress is being done in particular areas, there is a lot more that we can push together in that direction.
Excellent. Brief and to the point. So with that, I would like to turn it over to the audience, including online. And I've received a few questions online, 3 of them from Anonymous. To the whole
That's
panel
not good.
are about technology and how technology can be used, AI, blockchain, other digital tools, and whether that could play a role in creating greater transparency and in influencing how you go about with your disclosure. And I don't know, Kim, whether you would also want to say something about that. But if I may first ask the panel any views on this question, technology. Yeah, do you want to start?
On the technology, maybe is that what I will start? I mean, I have my own views, but I think what would be super helpful, and maybe it's more like a process rather than technology, but having a one-stop shop where you have all the credit information, but the ESG and impact, almost like a GEMS database crossed with DFI Transparency Index, using some sort of technology or database where you can have that all in one place, would make private credit investing into EM much smoother, and is something that I would love to see in the next few years. And I think we do have the brains as well as the technology to do that, but it's something that you really need to put a workforce together to do it and focus on. But I think with that you can achieve quite a few practical things with regards to making blended funds more replicable, for example. So I think that's my take on this question.
Excellent. Thank you. Quick reaction, Lisandro?
3 words come to my mind. Number 1 is what Wiki said, accessibility is clearly an area where technology can put this data in formats that are accessible to multiple audiences across the world. Second point, I think that when we're thinking about the internal incentives and the resources that you have to have a chief transparency officer, I think technology can make all of our efforts to become more transparent actually more efficient and faster and cheaper. Because a lot of what we do, I mean, take the example of the climate data that I handle in my team. We have really literally 20 people reviewing every single operation and making calculations and balances and cross-referencing to get the data. But if you have an AI tool these days, I mean, that can give you all the information in a couple of seconds. And then final point that I would make that I think, we don't mention a lot in the conversation about transparency, but there is a lot that can be learned from transparency. And I think the overall learning agenda of processing large amount of information across multiple agencies can give you a lot of insights on how you can use that data to affect the outcomes. And I think adding that angle, I think, is important.
Good. Maria, quick reaction.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're investing at the moment in a big data platform. I mean, this is it's a multi-year sort of project for us, but a place, a portal that, first of all, for an investee, is they can go on and get a tailor-made request for all the types of data we would ask for. So that would be climate, it would be gender, it would be impact, et cetera. And then that in the back end gives me an analytic tool that I can look across my portfolio. And we're hoping that we're launching this next year. I think that will enable us to be able to do more with the data, right? First of all, and AI, we're piloting a few areas where that can also be helpful. I think there's another step we'd like to do, which is then take this tool, if it's successful, to the other DFIs and say, can we combine this? I mean, can you imagine a world where investee can go and, in fill in the same questionnaire for multiple DFIs. And so this is something we're investing in at the moment. And AI, as I said, we're piloting a few ways that we can use it for efficiency, but it's the way forward for sure.
Yeah.
That's great. If you manage to get more than one institution
exactly.
to use the same tool, you're going to get a medal.
I'm gonna take you up.
Yeah.
He was inviting us to imagine, not necessarily.
Yeah, imagine. Just quickly, Kim, any perspectives? Kim Abbott, Vested Impact, a fantastic AI tool to measure impact.
5 years, we've been working on using AI and big data to help improve impact assessment and outcomes measurement, working on both sides. So we work with the Asian Development Bank, but we also work on the investor side, with your UBSs. A lot of the time, because of the absence of data, they will look. And I think they're probably similar to you, Lissandra. What I would say is we see it's definitely helpful for efficiency. It's helpful for independence, because what we do is we pull in 200 million academic papers. So what is the base of evidence that says what has worked or does work? And the other thing it's useful for is the dynamic context in which this all operates in. So we pull on we say 100 million impact data points, but it's the World Bank data, it's the OECD data, it's Eurostat, it's all that data that says the project ex ante might have been set, but the world in which it's operating in can change as well as the project. So what happens when food security goes through the floor or there's a drought in Jordan? How does that impact the impacts in the portfolio? So I guess I'd say the three things, but the final thing I'd say is human in the loop is still really necessary, because it doesn't solve the last bit on your report, which is community engagement. And that's what we stress to a lot of the private sector who think our tool is the answer. We say it doesn't remove the need to engage with the stakeholders who are impacted. So that's probably just the risk, I'd say, where AI, well, what we see in our history with it, it's not there yet, which I think it's good to hear. Lissandra, you say it's an excellent independent verification, but it's not necessarily the silver bullet to just do everyone's job for them.
Thank you, Kim. That was very helpful.
Hans-Peter.
I have another couple of questions while others think about it. David, to you, maybe you can touch on this as well. So one is by Zanat Ferdouz from Agora Global, and another is by Anonymous. And they're both essentially about the role of culture and competition in promoting the absence of transparency, if you want. And in Zanat's question, it's about the difference in the culture between the public and the private arms of these institutions. And the other, it's more generally about, what can we do about culture? And maybe you could comment on that, David, and all the while others in the room may want to think about lifting their arms.
Thanks, Hans-Peter. I mean, I think it's all about incentives. And this has been raised already in our discussion, but whenever people are in cultures where, taking a risk or kind of disclosing more information creates a negative incentive or a risk for that person, in terms of, like if the incentives are to be more cautious, then it's never going to happen. And I think what's been really good about the World Bank scorecard is that it kind of aligns the impacts that you want to see with how people in the institution are actually evaluated. And that, to your point earlier, that there aren't like hundreds of indicators, but actually you have a kind of clear sense of what's going to drive impact and what you're going to get rewarded for. But I think it also gets back to the technology point, because this issue of building dashboards, it's almost like coffee tables, like the coffee table books. They look great, but unless you have a community to use them and feedback loops from that community, then you're not going to have the impact that is needed. And we've done a lot of work. We used to publish a flagship report called the Data Report, which was evaluating G7 or G8 governments' commitments to Africa. That took a team of 4 people 7 months. It now takes us 7 minutes because we've built all the data pipelines. But we've also started a project with Google called Data Commons. And the vision is really to do for the world's public data what Google Maps did for spatial data, remove all the transaction costs, and build an AI tool on top of it that you can just ask a question and get the answer immediately with the trust that it will be up-to-date data and it will be accurate. But you need those communities that can be vectors of trust so that they're using that data and translating that into their own audiences and the communities that they influence. So I think, the combination of more readily available data, communities that are using it, and then the incentives for institutions to do the right thing and disclose this information is a powerful cocktail, and we need to kind of be delivering all those things together.
Right. Yes, and as private capital mobilization becomes more central to the strategy of these institutions, maybe that is going to impact culture as well. Maybe that's going to bring transparency into the mission as sort of a key product, and that in turn might change the dynamics. I have a hand over here, please. Can you just present yourself?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Veronica Stratford-Tuke. I work at International Alert. We're an international peace building organization. Yeah, really welcome the discussion today. I have a question about frontier markets, and also for context, we work with some of the DFIs, helping them think through how you navigate like fragility and conflict in these types of markets. In the context of the kind of increasing transparency on impact, which is really welcome, we know that actually kind of your impact in a slightly more developed market will look different, and also your ticket size will be bigger, your returns will be bigger, and that can actually then incentivize more investment to those places, despite the fact that more fragile or frontier markets have desperate need and very kind of well designed, intelligently designed, context kind of specific investments in those more fragile places can have a transformative effect, but often over a bit of a longer time scale, and it can look a bit different. How are you bringing out these nuances in the impact data and in the way the data is going to be shared so that it doesn't skew incentives away from the places that really need it?
Interesting question. Maria and Lisandro?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer it. So I mentioned our impact framework, which sort of guides our allocation, and it really incentivizes our investment teams. I mean, everyone likes to get a high score. It really is as simple as human nature as that. And the way that the score is developed is very intentionally. It sort of equally weights what you would see in middle income markets, more climate related opportunities with low income reach, including fragile markets. And we actually, because we have this tool, we've set corporate targets, climate targets. So we have, sort of 30% climate finance target, but also a 30% target on low income reach, which includes fragile markets. And so that's just, just in terms of incentivization, we've been very intentional in that, and actually looking forward to the next strategy period. Don't quote me on this because we haven't refined it completely, but you're only going to see an increased focus on frontier markets. So it's sort of core of what we do. Now, in the data point, this is an ongoing challenge, right? Which is how do you get better data, especially when it comes to the stakeholders that you're reaching. So how are you reaching the low income populations? What's the data behind that? And so we've done a variety of things. This is where AI could in the future come in as well. But we've been working, on surveys. We've been looking at proxies. We're working with a number of different data providers and other DFIs to share platforms in terms of data and stakeholder measurement. But it is a continuous challenge for us.
Maybe a few words. So I really very much sympathize with the point of the differences between, more fragile environments and less fragile. When we were thinking about the scorecard, what was clear to us, we were saying even the word results framework of logical framework in a fragile context loses a bit of meaning, because you don't go directly from your financing to the results. It's a zigzagging that you do all the time. So when we embedded that in the scorecard, what you can do now, if you go to the website, there is a section on the website that is called Build Your Own Scorecard. There you would select that you only want to see the scorecard results for the fragile countries using the harmonized list across MDBs on fragility. And then the 22 indicators of the scorecard will only turn indicators for fragile countries. You can do the same when you do that by income level. So if you're interested in the lowest income countries, you can do that. So I think that's an important feature for us that we didn't have before, where we say you have an entire scorecard now that can be tailored to this type of countries. But importantly, because I was talking about the zigzagging, what you can see as well is the historical trends on how our impact has variated across these countries. So it will give you a sense of whether some of the results move upward and backwards and forward as well. So that hopefully invites you to do analysis, because all the data can be disaggregated and the methodologies are, as I said, reproducible. So it can, if you help us generate insights about that, it would be something that I would invite you and encourage to do.
Great. Let me take one more question here. Then I turn to you, and then we have like 1 minute to close.
Okay.
So there's a question from Anna Roggenbuck from the Bankwatch Network, and she's asking, so European institutions tend to be fairly low down the scale, not all of them, good exception here, but many of them are. EBRD is also doing a little bit better than the average. What explains that? And is there something that can be done? Is there perhaps something that the One Campaign can do, try to lobby shareholders? What is preventing European institutions from doing better on this count? And let me, perhaps I should just ask you to come in with your question as well, and then we can close. Sorry, your name.
Luis from the consulting firm Carney. My question is, we're talking about private capital mobilization and sort of the things that investors need to see. And I suppose I'm curious, beyond sort of financial return data and impact data, whether transparency around sort of operational effectiveness is relevant from an investor perspective and from the DFI perspective. I'm thinking in terms of things like impact per unit of paid in capital, or speed of deployment of the capital that's paid in, or project completion success rates, those sorts of things. I mean, is that relevant to the investor community, and is that even realistic to produce? Is that already in mind among the DFIs and MDBs? Thanks.
That's great. So while panel thinks about that last question, maybe I'll direct the first one. Bit difficult for you to comment on it, I think, but to David, and maybe Gary or Sally want to say something about that as well. So what's the problem with the Europeans?
Gelato.
Gelato. David, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry. Short answer is I'm not entirely sure. I think that part of this is the incentives that these institutions have, and particularly when you're looking at, I mean, I lived in Brussels for 5 years and kind of worked a lot with the European institutions on this. They're kind of quite slow moving. It's quite procedural. You need to kind of fit into a very specific way of communicating these issues. And I think, a lot of the kind of active civil society organizations that are working on this work on the European 7-year budget and the issues around the volume of finance, and maybe not so much on, fighting for more transparency and impact data. But because these institutions are so fragmented and have overlapping mandates, and communicate in often such an impenetrable way, it's really difficult to get that information. I've been kind of pushing for more disclosure of what the global gateway investments actually mean. Where are they disclosed? And you often get, I was working with the Africa Europe Foundation, which I helped set up a few years ago. And often the questions that we were asking the institution had very simple answers, at least in my mind. It was like, what's the volume of finance? What are the projects? Where has it gone? But you get like very, very detailed kind of descriptive answers that don't really answer the question. So I think it all comes back to incentives, and we need more civil society activists fighting for this, which is why this report is so great and so important.
Okay, thanks. Incentives, culture, the Brussels syndrome. And I think I'm not going to go to you now because of time, but I'll give you perhaps Lisandro and Maria, just 30 seconds on this question.
This one. Good. So very clearly, the type of data that you talk about is data that a lot of actors are interested about, and the World Bank Group has actually been transparent and producing that data for decades. We have something next to the scorecard that is called the Organizational Effectiveness and Efficiency Dashboard that has all this data that you are talking about. I think what we want to make sure, and what we wanted when we created the scorecard, is that we hit all of these targets without missing the points. And the point is development. And sometimes when you communicate targets on disbursement, on speed, and then we congratulate ourselves for doing that, we forget that that's not the point. The point of hitting the targets is development to the communities that matter. And this is why our focus right now has been on the outcomes. But that data is available in our systems for anybody that wishes to consume it.
I think I would say it varies across investors, but there are some foundational ones that matters to all investors, like speed of deployment. One of the reasons why we had expanded our fund to not only look at infrastructure investments, the fund that we have with IFC, but also to then look across sectors, was because for infra, for it to hit all eligibility criteria, but in infra in general, deployment can be very slow. But that is also linked to returns, because the slower your deployment speed is, the slower income is generated and returned to investors. And so when we expanded the fund to look at further sectors, especially FIG, which is a very prolific sector for a lot of the MDBs and DFIs, given the speed of deployment, then we saw that immediate increase in deployment rate, and that was super helpful. But there weren't any metrics linked to that they were tracking. It's more like you get a sense of how quickly the fund is deployed, and like, you know, you need to be faster within, otherwise the investment period will run out and you can't extend it forever. So I think that's foundational across all investors. Things like impact per dollar spent is probably more for the more impact focused and more sophisticated investors around those, whereby they have metrics to hit. And we see that more on the philanthropic investor side rather than some of the larger institutional investors. But yeah, I think my answer is that it varies.
Great. Maria, final word?
On
No?
the subject, no.
No.
Yeah.
Then we have to come to close. Sam had promised that I was going to provide a conclusion. I can't. We're over our time. Just want to note one thing. I found it a really fascinating discussion. There's so much information that's come. I hope that's going to be useful for Publish What You Fund as you approach sort of the next phase of your reporting. I also want to say it just demonstrates, this discussion demonstrates how powerful this kind of reporting, this index is that you have. It's as Maria had said, everybody wants to look good on these scores, but it also just provides so much material for a discussion with the institutions to clarify, you know, where the gaps are. And so this is great job, Publish What You Fund. Keep doing it. With that, I want to close this. Thank you.
Thank you.